concede, as I did in my adjudication, that not everything about a team is brilliant. So even though closing government won this debate, it did not mean that I needed to say every aspect of their extension was fantastic, that we appreciated everything. It shows that it was a close debate to admit that even though a team won, it doesn't mean everything they did was perfect, and that leads on to the feedback role. Similarly, in not all debates do you need to tell the team that came fourth that they did everything terribly. In a really good room, like a team that comes fourth will be excellent, but some team will come fourth. So it's okay to praise the things that they do well, as long as you can draw out the distinctions between teams. That's what your adjudication should focus on, is a comparative analysis of issues. So look at what is the distinction between teams. Which issues were responded to that were important, and which issues weren't. What was the substantive contribution of the closing teams, and how important was it? Who ultimately won this issue of whether it was too large a risk that innocents would be killed? Which team ultimately won that issue? The second part of an adjudication process would then be to provide feedback to the teams. And this might be a helpful way to start discussing some of the problems with this debate. As Jan said earlier, one of the crucial things to do when you do this in your oral adjudication, and it is the easiest way to avoid having complaints lodged against you with an adjudication team, is to draw a line between what the decision was based on and what your feedback is. If you begin when a team comes up to you and says, why did we get the donut? Why did we place fourth in this debate? And you said, I think you had some timing issues. They will run faster to the CA team than you can count to 10 to say, we lost the debate because we had timing problems, okay? What you really need to say is, this argument in your case wasn't sufficiently developed. One of the reasons it wasn't developed well was because of your timing issues. My advice to you for future rounds is that you need to do your rebuttal more quickly because you're wasting too much of your speech on rebuttal, and if you'd had more time to develop this argument, then you may have won that issue of the debate. So there's a clear difference between how they can improve on things they did badly and the reasons why they lost the debate. And making that clear to teams when you provide them with feedback is a crucial way to ensure that teams don't complain about you and that they understand the reasons for the decision. Okay, why was this debate hard to judge, and what's the types of feedback that we would give to teams? One of the reasons that this debate was hard to judge was each speaker often had quite good moments in their speech, and then frequently in response to a point of information, or maybe just a substantive point, 2 minutes later in the speech, it was like a real low point in the debate. So speeches themselves were inconsistent. Similarly, we felt that often teams were inconsistent. So on both opening half teams, we worried that neither second speaker added enough material. This is not to say that they were bad speakers and that the debate was lost because of them. But in terms of what the debate added, we thought that the debate got going at the first speakers on those teams, but not much was added at second. Similarly, we thought both summary speeches were really strong, and the summary speech for the government was very well structured, whereas other points of the debate lacked that clarity and structure, which made it harder to follow. And that was one of the other things that distinguished between teams. Ultimately, obviously, our biggest point of feedback was that the opening government needed to be more clear about what their objectives were in the debate. We think the principled argument wasn't made in a principled way, so part of the feedback we would say is to say, governments shouldn't do this because of the messaging effect, is a practical reason. Does that make sense to everyone? So there is a difference between saying governments shouldn't do this because it is immoral, it is an abuse of their position of power, it is disrespectful to the dignity of an individual, to saying governments shouldn't do this because it sends the wrong message. So one of the things the first proposition needed to work on was developing those 2 points separately. To flesh out first that it was someone in the position of the government should never sanction killing, even if they're killing to remedy a wrong or to remedy a crime. The second point is one that says this is really dangerous because the message that the government sends when they kill is that killing is okay. They undermine their own moral authority. The second thing that the opening government needed to do in terms of objectives, that's a principled argument. In terms of the practical argument, because of the way they structured their case, the point of effectiveness wasn't really developed. We had some material in the deputy speech about crimes of passion and suicide missions that was dealt with in the end by the closing opposition in the summary speech. when they talked about why most people respond to the deterrent of using the life. So the aims and objectives of the opening government were too implicit and they weren't explored enough. They needed to come up and more clearly state, we think the death penalty is just wrong, and even if it isn't wrong, we think it's ineffective, and we think that therefore the government shouldn't do it. And then just prove those two things. The feedback to the opening opposition would obviously be that they should have thought through this line of argument about when they were willing to defend the death penalty more. This is a difficult debate for both teams because there's no clear international status quo. So in light of that, the opening opposition are free to defend the death penalty in certain circumstances, not all circumstances. So they don't have to defend the way the Chinese government might use a death penalty to like summarily execute people without trial. Okay? But the burden they initially assumed to say there are certain types of crime that we think are so abhorrent that the death penalty is justified is fine. But you can't also argue then that countries have free right to determine when they should use the death penalty in their cultural context. So it was having a clear position that tripped up the opening opposition in terms of that. Second of all, we think the opening opposition needed to spend more time developing material at second speaker and in making sure that all the stakeholders in the debate were covered. In terms of feedback for the closing teams, we think that both of their extensions, and this would be common to both, were new, but perhaps more could have been done to explain the importance of that extension. So, again, the question of innocence became very prominent in this debate, and a lot of the argument rebuttal was about that issue, but it wasn't, that was just like, you know, the closing government were lucky that happened because they didn't spend a lot of time explaining why the most important thing in the debate was that nobody was wrongfully convicted. And a lot of the opposition line of argument, which was sometimes persuasive, was to say, the risk of that is so small, it's not important. So the closing government themselves should have done more work to explain why their extension answered the central question of the debate. And the same thing applied to the closing opposition, who through this extension of particularly the aspect about tax, was a point that was perhaps misrepresented by the closing government. But again, it's not the key determinant in the debate about, you know, the tax burden that society assumes of people who spend their life in prison. So there were new material, but the advice we'd give to the closing half teams was to work on the relevance of that material. Do people have questions about the way we determined our decision? Or about the debate, which was very confusing and often at times very close and muddy? Because I think it's probably most productive if you guys lead the rest of the session by telling us what you're not sure on and us trying to give guidance on that.
So, for the opening opposition, it would be even better if they just put that for only a certain issue, for example, like terrorists should be still given a death penalty, like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think either line of argument is fine, right? But the biggest problem with them is that you can't run both at once. They're absolutely within their rights, and as an adjudicator giving feedback, I would advise them to take the first line of argument that's more narrow, because it seems like a needlessly large burden to say we defend the right of any government ever to execute their citizens because the death penalty is just okay. Like, so it's not that the cultural relativism line of argument isn't interesting, and I think the way it developed in the second half of the debate when it talked about the community acceptance of justice, like the community has to think justice is done, was an interesting permutation of that argument. The reason why I would say, following the first line, when you say, in these exceptional cases, we support the death penalty, is just because you're not creating a burden that requires you to defend the actions of the Chinese government or whatever. So it means that you don't have to prove as much of opposition. Yeah.
I was going to ask, what do you guys think about the level of the debate? I mean, is this an average debate or what is it?
Sorry?
The level of debate average, below average, above average, or what?
Yeah, I would say that this debate was around about the average mark. Not that all the speakers in the debate were average, but as I said, I think the debate as a whole suffered from speakers themselves being inconsistent. So even though some quite good material was developed at certain points of this debate, the way that speeches were structured, or the inconsistencies within speeches meant that they were brought down towards the average level. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to know from your perspective, who's the best speaker and why?
That's actually a very good question. I think that we would say the opposition whip was the best speaker.